What's up, friends? Welcome back to the office. Obviously, not at any ancient sites. Flights have been delayed. As you guys know, crazy conflicts around the Middle East. So I thought, well, what better time than to talk about what is happening, what is going on. You might think it's a little bit off topic, but if you watch the videos, you know they are always centered around history. Now, right now, we are just 20, 30 years early, but make no mistake, this is some pretty crazy historical events happening right now, especially if you're around the same age as me, if you're mid-20s, 30s. This is probably the most significant thing that's happened in our lives. Now, I want to make it very clear, there's a massive distinction between what they tell us is happening and what is really taking place behind the scenes, because it seems like they don't even know what the heck is happening. If you watch the news, if you watch live White House broadcasts, they don't even know what the hell's going on or how serious this conflict is. I mean, the head of US counterterrorism just resigned because he said Iran posed no threat. So what the heck is going on? What the hell is going on, man? Now, with history, this is why I'm so passionate about it, and I try and give you guys insights onto these events. You can start to form your own pattern recognition. And then you won't be so surprised when things like this happen, which I wasn't. I was posting about this months ago in December that this would happen. If you follow me on Instagram, you would know. So history is very important. You need to know, have a basic understanding, and you can see the chessboard and where the pieces are moving in front of you. Now, we can go back even just within the last 60, 70 years, which is nothing in terms of a historical timeline. So many things have happened. Absolutely insane stuff. We've been to some of these places together already. Vietnam, for example. We started the YouTube series there. And if you watch the series from Vietnam, you would have a greater understanding of the Vietnam-US war and what took place. I think it's a good example to start with, and then we will go across to the Middle East and we'll give a bit of a historical overview of what's happening there. And then you guys might be able to see the difference between what they tell you is happening, what the media says, what the people in power report, versus where the money is moving behind the scenes. Very important to follow. So, Vietnam, 1960s, after World War II, of course. This is the Cold War period. This is a great push and pull between the USSR, the Soviet Union, and the US. It's actually when the CIA got created, when they first sort of begun after World War II. Now, allegedly, their first few operations were leading coups in countries, flipping neutral countries to favoring the US. Allegedly. Indonesia is a great example of that. You should look that up. Jakarta method. Quite fascinating. We have covered it in another video when we were in Indonesia, but not many people know. Almost 3 million people killed in Indonesia during this time period. This is happening all around the world. And it leads on up until the 70s and 80s and 90s. This Soviet Union, USSR versus US push and pull. Now, with the Vietnam War, US officially put boots on the ground, 1965. They didn't leave until 1975. So 10 years, 9 or 10 years of direct troop, boots on the ground kind of war. What was the reason for the Vietnam War? Well, they say domino theory. The domino theory is the commonly talked about reason for having to get involved in Vietnam. Domino theory was, if Vietnam fell to communism, every other country would fall around it. Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, Malaysia, Malacca Strait, critical shipping channel. So that was the theory, and that's what they were telling the general public. And also to give the Vietnamese, the South Vietnamese, a better way of life. Right. End result, well, as you know, Cambodia, Laos, Thailand, they're all communist shitholes now. Because as you know, the US didn't win that war. Well, obviously not. These countries are amazing. They are some of the most visited countries in terms of tourism in the whole world. So, doesn't make much sense. Did they really believe the domino theory? Are they that terrible at military analytics and forecasting what's going to happen? They're supposed to be the strongest, best military in the world. Doesn't make much sense. Well, if you look behind the scenes, you can see maybe a different kind of thing was moving. Now, people have talked about this. In fact, a lot of people called the Vietnam War a laboratory for military or industrial complex. Research and development. There's some projects, there's one called Igloo White, which you guys might not have heard about. Remember, they put boots on the ground 1965. For about 10 years prior to that, they had a secret war going on in Laos and into North Vietnam. This was led by the CIA. So they were already there. They were already in Southeast Asia for 9 or 10 years before they even put boots on the ground. They were leading all of these research and development programs. They were testing things like napalm, Agent Orange, these chemicals. I think they're called herbicides, whatever that word is, deforestation, crazy chemicals that now have ridiculous birth defects still today in the areas where they napalmed the hell out of Vietnam. So if they were already in Vietnam before they even openly told the public about it, then they would have known and had an idea of the type of enemy they were fighting, because they led huge bombing campaigns in Vietnam and Laos. Laos, for example, this will probably shock you guys if you've never heard of this. Laos is the most bombed country ever in existence, and Laos was never involved in the war. More bombs dropped on Laos than Germany and Japan combined from World War II. How freaking insane is that? Now, if that doesn't say military laboratory experiment program, I don't know what does. You can look at these numbers. The Igloo White program, which was the first time where they'd used electronic sensors in war, right? They were trying to make a huge kind of sensor fence, a huge barrier along the Laos border. They had these missiles which they chucked down, and they had these sensors where they could see if there was any human activity. And then that information was relayed to a bomber or a survey kind of plane, and they could track where people were. This is the first kind of time ever in history this kind of thing was done. They're trying to make warfare a little bit more electronic, right? Just Igloo White, this is the name of the research program. Just this program alone, $1.5 billion spent. Now, do you think they really believe that they could win? Could they actually defeat the Vietnamese? I think they would have seen what happened with the French. The French were there. The French had colonized, set up a colony in Vietnam for the last 100 years before the US even got there. They had some huge defeats. Dien Bien Phu is a big one for the French, humiliating for the Bonjours. So the US had a lot of intel on the sort of enemy they were fighting. Guerrilla kind of tunnel warfare. You guys know the Chu Chi tunnels. We visited this stuff. The enemy is almost invisible. How the hell do you expect to beat them when you can't even see where the enemy is? Now, I found an interesting article. This was published the same year, I believe the same day that troops were put on the ground. The same day that boots were put on the ground. This gives estimates for the objective for the US intervening with boots on the ground. 70% to avoid a humiliating US defeat. 20% to keep South Vietnam in the adjacent territory from Chinese hands. 10% to permit the people of South Vietnam to enjoy a better, free way of life. So it's pretty obvious they had the intel they were never going to win. But, as many people put it, as these guys wrote this in New York Times, it's clear that Vietnam was just a laboratory for military experiments. So very different to what they were telling the general public back home. The domino theory, communism, we need to provide South Vietnam a better way of life. What was the end result? They had a absolutely humiliating withdrawal, similar to what happened in Afghanistan. They actually tried to organize it sneakily so that there wasn't mass panic. 60,000 odd US troops dead, $1.5 trillion in US taxpayer money spent. I think 3 million, upwards of 3 million Vietnamese killed. So how does that go hand in hand with giving South Vietnamese a better way of life? And then with their withdrawal, you had a few 100,000 Vietnamese as refugees. They fled the country. People drowned. Vietnamese were holding onto helicopters trying to get out of Vietnam. So this makes no sense. You got to be 20 IQ if you can't see the difference between what they're saying they were trying to do versus what was actually going on. Who was the real winners here? Well, private sectors. Billions and billions of dollars in profit in these research and development programs, chemical weapons, ammunition manufacturing, helicopters, planes. Pretty obvious to see who's the winner there. I mean, the US soldiers, they were making $80 to $120 a month, if that. And then if they're lucky to even return, they have the craziest PTSD ever from freaking jungle warfare, crawling through tunnels, trying to clear out tunnels where the Vietnamese had laid traps, booby traps, snakes. A lot of the time throughout history, when they have to get boots on the ground, an event needs to take place in which it creates a reason and a justification for putting boots on the ground, right? This avoids civilian pushback and riots, civil war, stuff like this. Now, the Gulf of Tonkin incident, I think was in 1964. This is a very heavily debated topic in terms of the Vietnam War, right? Gulf of Tonkin incident, basically what happened, there was 2 separate torpedo attacks. The North Vietnamese tried to strike the US Navy one night. I believe it was Navy ships. And they reported that. The ships reported that back to Washington. And then another night, terrible weather, big storms. The operator reported another torpedo incoming. They sent that off to Washington. And now the captain of the ship also sent a letter sent the information to Washington saying this needs to be further investigated before any serious things happen because of this. Because the operator, looking at the radars, was very overeager. No one visually saw anything. The weather was terrible. Pretty obvious that it was mainly a false reporting. Well, 6 months later, it seems like that was enough to justify boots on the ground. And what about the face of the North Vietnamese, the face of the communists? Who was it? Ho Chi Minh. Now, here's a long history, which the US obviously would have known before they started saying domino theory and communist takeover. Ho Chi Minh, well-educated man, traveled overseas. He actually tried to join the United Nations, was rejected from all of this, tried to get help from Western countries, couldn't get help from anyone because there was a French colony there. The US needed to maintain good relationships with the French. So he was in a position where no country would help him. All he wanted was Vietnam to be independent. He wanted his country to be his country. Makes total sense, as you would, especially after 100 years of French rule, and then the Japanese takeover in World War II, and then prior to that, constant Chinese invasion over the last 800 odd years. He wanted Vietnam to be for the Vietnamese. Now, the only countries that would support him were the Chinese, or the Soviet Union. So then, out roll the propaganda. He's a huge communist. Communism's going to take over. That's where that comes from. So either the US intelligence is absolutely pathetic and terrible at their job, which is very unlikely, or they knew all of this, but they just have to justify a reason to go in, spend money, convince citizens and troops to go and die in a foreign country fighting people that are just like them. It's pretty obvious to see what's going on. Look, I know this is a lot. I know I'm rambling. I know I'm just jabbering away, but this is very freaking important for you to understand. The Vietnam War, like, what is the purpose other than billions in profit for private sectors? Now, this is how the US economy works. This is how, throughout history, empires have obviously worked. But It is privatized in America. The government has jobs they need done. They release it and they get bids. Private companies bid on these jobs, right? These private companies make a shit ton of cash. And then it's also public. You can buy shares in things like Lockheed and Martin. All right? I need you to understand that it is a lot freaking more than just, we need to free these people. We need to help them. We need to stop communism for the greater good of the world. Unplug your freaking mind from the propaganda machine and just follow the money, dude. Like, I know this is a lot. I know I'm rambling a lot, but freaking focus. Turn off your TikTok brain and focus. You're going to learn some stuff. Now let's go talk about the Middle East. We have to go back to the 1930s to understand kind of what is going on here. I'm going to brush over it broadly just so you get an understanding, because I could ramble on about the Middle East for 10, 20 hours. But I want to give you an understanding of why we are here today, why we are at a point where we have escalating war rapidly with Iran. We have head of counter-terrorism. We have people resigning from the topmost roles in the US. This is crazy. What's happening now is crazy. You need to understand the historical context of it. Let's go back to the 1930s. America, they're wanting to send some ventures and have some capital coming in from other places around the world. So they go to Saudi Arabia. They start looking for oil, and they have some great success. They form some alliances with Saudi Arabia. Now, interestingly enough, the people that they form alliances with, one of the guys who is in charge of the oil infrastructure, building these oil rigs and stuff like that, his name is Mohammed bin Laden. Might sound familiar. Yes, that is Osama bin Laden's father. So the US are over there setting up good relationships. Everyone's getting extremely wealthy. Mohammed bin Laden, he's getting very, very wealthy. He has like 22 wives and 50-something children, one of them being Osama bin Laden. We will talk about him later on. Now, 1940s, 1950s, you have another state that comes into play, Israel. Interesting and very, very, what's the word? A lot of clashing, right? You have Muslims, but you have two types of Muslims. If there's any of my Muslim friends in here, please drop some more information in the comments. But the way I understand it, there is Shia and there is Sunni. Most of the Middle East is Sunni Muslim. So Shia is a little bit more, I wouldn't say extremist, but they're just more kind of by the book. They look at their leaders as being, would you say, spiritually appointed, like how Muhammad had his bloodline in recession after him. Something like that, right? They're just more, they hold to a higher standard and to like a higher power because the people believe they are sort of spiritually appointed or closer to God, if that makes sense. I'm probably butchering it, but that's how Shia is a little bit more on the extreme side. And then the Sunnis, they seem to be the ones that form all the alliances and business connections and relationships with the West and outside countries, which of course the Shia don't like because it sort of goes against the core beliefs of Islam, right? The Sunni seem to be a lot more materialistic. You can look at a place like Dubai or the UAE, right? That's quite evident. They're obviously very successful, but very, very wealthy. So very materialistic, if that makes sense. I don't mean to offend anyone. It's just I'm trying to understand it as well for myself. So talking about it, I can process it. And then, of course, you have Israel, which is Judaism, but also there is Zionists, or you can't say Zionism, it's not really a word, but Zionists, right? A more extreme version of Judaism in some way. Correct me in the comments if you want to add more information. Now, Iran at the time, this is 1950s, 1960s. Iran's doing quite well. They actually have a democratically elected leader. I forget his name, but he was pretty greatly loved. And remember we talked about the push and the pull of the Soviet Union and the US. Well, this guy in Iran, the leader, he wants to expand trade relationships. He also wants to nationalize the oil, something that you might be familiar with. Other leaders like Gaddafi, all these guys end up seeming to be extremely evil and needing to be arrivederci. Quite strange. The US and the British, they don't like this guy because he might be forming alliances with the Soviet Union. So they lead a coup and they actually overthrow him. They go into Iran itself, a foreign country, and mess with its internal affairs and politics. They overthrow this guy. They put in their own leader. He's a puppet. It's a puppet government called the Shah something. I forget the name. So he rules. Now, for some Iranians, this is also a good time for them, right? It becomes westernized, blah, blah, blah. But obviously the West is using it for their benefit, for trade relationships, stuff like that. So this is why people like Charlie Kirk have talked about the US is the reason why Iran became radical. What he means by that is because the US and the British overthrew the democratically elected guy in Iran and put their own leader in, because it's inherently Muslim already, it creates a more extreme version of Islam, a more extreme version of Muslims. Even if it wasn't Islamic, if it was Christian, or if it was Jewish people, the same thing would happen, right? If you go in and mess with them, you're going to get people that are going to be more aggressive at the people coming in. Like, it's just how it works. So that is why people say that the US bred the extreme regime that is in power today. So this is kind of happening in the background. We'll talk about the regime soon as we progress in historical order. Now we progress to the mid 1970s, right? The late 1970s. This is when a lot of stuff starts to kick off. Well, after World War I, after World War II, the reason why the US became so powerful and so popular, it's called the gold standard. The US dollar was backed by gold, for those of you who don't know. Why is that? Well, all the wars in Europe, all the countries in Europe were like always under chaos. The US said, we will store your gold for you, we'll keep it safe. In return, we'll give you bonds, treasuries. We'll technically give you like promises that you'll earn interest, right, on your gold that you deposit with us. So all of these countries gave the US their gold. The US became the global storage of gold, and in return became very profitable and very powerful because they had the reserve currency. That's what the US dollar was. It was backed by gold, gold standard. They started to print more and more US dollars during World War II and after World War II during the Cold War. Countries realized this and they said, hang on a second, the bonds or the treasuries that you've given us, this paper money that you gave us in return for our gold, it's not really worth that much anymore. We want our gold back. A few countries actually went and got their gold back from the US, 1970s, late 1960s, 1970s. So the US was like, well, we need to tie our currency to something now. It's not backed by anything. This is just paper money. It means nothing. Well, they had great relationships with the Saudis, with the oil. Oil was flowing. It was extremely profitable. So they went to the Saudis and they said, we will protect you militarily. We'll make sure that you never get overthrown or lose power. But in return, we want you to always sell oil. Any oil that you sell from the Middle East has to be sold in US dollars. Every country has to buy the oil in US dollars. So that is called the petrodollar. This is 1979, 1978, I believe. So this is when the US dollar is now backed by oil. Very important for what's happening today. We'll discuss that soon. So that's what happens then. But then in 1979, there is a uprising in Iran. The Shah, who is the puppet government of the US and the British, he gets overthrown. And this Islamic regime comes into power, the very same regime that's still in power today, that the US is at war with, the exact same regime. They come into power, and what they do is they actually send out broadcast messages to the rest of the Middle East. Because remember, these guys are Shia, so they are Shia Muslims, and they're a little bit pissed off at the rest of the Middle East for allowing trade and allowing the US to build bases in the Middle East. They're pretty pissed off at that. But there's the two different sections. Most of the Middle East is Sunni, like 70-80%. A very small minority is Shia. Iran, this regime that comes into power 1979, 1980, they broadcast these messages to all the civilians in the Middle East, telling them to uprise and take back their government and overthrow their government, right? They're calling out mostly to the Shia population. Well, Iraq at the time, we have someone called Saddam Hussein. He is becoming very popular. He's right next to Iran. Iran is here. This is Iran. This is Iraq. And then all the way across, you have Israel over here. Israel's secretly loving this, of course, because they're like, yes, let them fight. Let them fight each other. They are our enemies anyway. Let them fight. They have their own ideas and their own vision for being in the Middle East. They want to obviously be in control. It is called the Greater Israel Project. You guys might have heard about this or might know about it. Now, interestingly enough, Iraq preemptively attacks Iran. So this starts the Iraq-Iran War, 1980. Pretty crazy. This is where things just start getting crazy and crazy. Crazier and crazier, right? So the US and Israel are loving this because they're like, yes, our enemies are fighting each other. The US obviously doesn't like Iran that much because they just got overthrown, their puppet government. Saddam Hussein, he has a lot of pushback from Iran because Iran has all of the US military equipment. They have the latest jets that the US left behind after they overthrew the government. Sounds familiar, right? Sounds like the Taliban in Afghanistan. Interesting. History always repeats. Now, Iran does pretty well. So Saddam Hussein in Iraq, he's like, shit, we need help. He calls to the US and Israel, we need help. Like, we need supplies. We need to push back against Iran. The US loves this because they want to hurt Iran because Iran just overthrew them. Secretly, behind the scenes, Israel is supplying Iran with weapons. Can you believe that? How crazy is that? The two very countries that are fighting each other today. In the 1980s, Israel was supplying Iran. Why? Because Iraq at the time, Iraq is obviously one country closer to Israel, so Iraq was seen as a greater enemy for Israel. Get rid of Iraq sooner, the better. So, Israel funding Iran. The US funding Iraq. The US and Israel are obviously great allies, right? They're always the US supplying Israel with everything they need. So absolutely ridiculous. The amount of blackmail and 180-degree flipping on each other that you'll see throughout this discussion is crazy. So Saddam Hussein, he's also getting supplies from the Soviet Union because the Soviet Union wants to get involved. Now, he starts using chemical weapons up in the north against the Kurds. The Kurds are very interesting people. They want to take over from Saddam Hussein, so they side with Iran during this war. And Saddam Hussein, he uses chemical weapons against the Kurds. Pretty devastating. But where did he get the chemical weapons from? Well, you could make the argument probably from the US, or maybe it was from the Soviet Union. A lot of you might be able to put more information in the comments. This is seen as like an international war crime, right? Using chemical weapons is just cooked. And guess what happens at the same time? The 1980s, absolutely crazy. The Soviet Union, as I talked about, the Cold War, the push and pull between the US and the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union tried to invade Afghanistan. Afghanistan's very far away. We said Iran, Iraq, Israel, Afghanistan way over here. Well, Soviet Union try and invade Afghanistan. Guess who goes over to Afghanistan to fight them off? Remember we mentioned Mohammed bin Laden. Well, his son. Mohammed bin Laden is extremely wealthy by now because of all the oil infrastructure and the relationship with the US. So Osama bin Laden, you know this guy, he goes over to Afghanistan to train with the Afghanis and fight against the Soviet Union, who's trying to come down from the north. Osama bin Laden just doesn't like any external powers in the Middle East, which, I mean, it's fair enough. He's obviously seen that his family did very well from connections with the US, but he's seen the blackmail that the US does. So he's very skeptical of foreign powers in the Middle East. Fair enough. And interestingly enough, because like I said, the US loves any time they can fight the Soviet Union, the US actually fund and send supplies and money. The US and Israel send supplies and money to Osama bin Laden. Guess what his group is called? I think he forms it later on, but they are known as Al-Qaeda. You guys might have heard of Al-Qaeda before. Quite interesting how it all ties together, right? So they do have a relationship, because if the US can use Osama bin Laden as a pawn on the chessboard to fight proxy wars with Soviet Union, they will. Very interesting. And then you have a lot more going on. Saddam Hussein is he gets pretty crushed. His economy gets crushed. He tries to take Kuwait to increase his economy again. And then the US step in and do some heavy bombing and some heavy campaigns against him to push him back so that they can keep the oil flowing. So that was also another oil crisis. So Iraq, Iran fighting each other, the US and Israel playing both sides of the war. Obviously very beneficial for them. If they can keep them fighting each other, then that's fine. Around this time, the USS Liberty, I think it's a little bit earlier, the 1960s, 1970s, USS Liberty, which is a US Navy ship, gets blown up. Who does it get blown up by? Iran? No. Iraq? No. Israel. A little bit weird. Well, towards the end of the Iraq-Iran war, the US actually shoot down, and I think it's an Iranian plane, so a civilian plane from Iran. They shoot down 290 civilians on the plane. They formally apologize and all of that stuff, but you can see how there's a lot of not so good connections between the US and Iran through history. Now, Israel is obviously not too happy because they wanted Saddam Hussein to be destroyed, because he always manages to build quite a powerful army. They're not too happy with this because Iraq is still there. Where does this bring us in terms of history? This brings us to the 2000s, the late 1990s, 2000s. What happens? As you guys know, 9/11. And as you know from 9/11, you know why passports are so expensive, right? Passports are fireproof, bomb-proof, building collapse-proof. Passports are incredible. They are made from the same material that Superman's suit is made from. You can only destroy passports with kryptonite, right? That's why they're so expensive and they take so long to make. That's the reason. Incredible material, passports. Now, they find passports in the wreckage of 9/11. And US intelligence is out to link 9/11 with Al-Qaeda. Interesting. These troops in Afghanistan. That is the intel from 9/11. Now, these guys are obviously very efficient. They're very good. US intelligence and counter-terrorism. They're obviously some of the best in the world. So they link it to Al-Qaeda, right? Pretty obvious. They have passports. Also, bin Laden, I believe Osama bin Laden takes responsibility for 9/11. But before any forensic search and any forensic studies can be done on the 9/11 destruction and all the rubble, all of that gets cleaned up because they found the passports, job done, we know who did it. Construction companies come in, get rid of all the rubble, send it on ships, send it to China for turning into scrap. Job done, no further investigation. Now, interestingly enough, on the night of 9/11, the Deputy Secretary of State, his name is Paul Wolfowitz. He is a Jewish guy. It's important to mention because if he was an extremist Muslim saying something like, this was definitely Israel, obviously there's an inherent bias, right? Because of his religious ties and stuff like that. So Paul Wolfowitz, a Jewish guy, head of Secretary of State, he says, completely ignores that it was Al-Qaeda. The intelligence documents say it's Al-Qaeda. We need to investigate them. Osama bin Laden has claimed responsibility, blah, blah, blah. Paul Wolfowitz says, we should look at Saddam Hussein in Iraq over, 1,000 miles away or 1,000 kilometers away? Iraq is ages away from Afghanistan. He says, we should investigate Iraq. Saddam Hussein is the head of all international terrorism. That's a direct quote from Paul Wolfowitz. And now in the meeting, everyone's kind of scratching their heads like, what are you talking about, mate? Like, you bloody lost your mind, mate. All right? Iraq's all the way in the middle of nowhere. We know that this was Al-Qaeda. Weird thing to say. And here's a direct quote in response to this, in response to what Paul Wolfowitz said. Here's a direct quote from the head of counterterrorism. This guy says, Mr. President, we were attacked on September 11th by Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan. Saddam Hussein and Iraq have nothing whatsoever to do with this. This was Joseph Coffer Black, the head of counterterrorism. But over the next few days, President Bush, they have a meeting in like his cabin lodge, right? And now direct quotes and direct evidence from this cabin lodge. Paul Wolfowitz is in President Bush's ear, explaining that, maybe Iraq is a good idea. I think if we hit Iraq and we hit Saddam Hussein, we can also get access to oil. We can get access to all of their oil in Iraq. It should be very easy. We can get in and out. We can hit Saddam Hussein. We can hit his military, his army. We can be in there and done. And now President Bush he's also, I think he's a former oil businessman. So this has planted the seed in President Bush's mind. What happens with the campaigns, the propaganda, the media? Well, like they have to convince the general public why they are going to war, because it is American taxpaying dollars that gets spent, right? So out rolls the media. Saddam Hussein has weapons of mass destruction.
Dangerous weapons of mass destruction into this country.
Saddam Hussein will continue to increase his capacity to wage biological and chemical warfare and will keep trying to develop nuclear weapons.
The question is really, how do we ensure that these weapons of destruction, these missiles, these chemical weapons, the nuclear program that is fast accelerating in Iraq, that these do not pose a threat in the aftermath of the crisis, assuming he gets out of Kuwait? This is an issue for the entire international community.
There is no question whatsoever that Saddam is seeking and is working and is advancing towards the development of nuclear weapons. No question whatsoever.
He has them. He has weapons of mass destruction, guys. Even though any weapons that he does have is already from America selling them his weapons to fight Iran. I mean, dude, what an absolute joke, right? Saddam Hussein got weapons from America to fight Iran. And now America's saying Saddam Hussein has weapons of mass destruction. This is in a direct response to 9/11. He has weapons of mass destruction. We have to take out his weapons of mass destruction before another terrorist attack can possibly happen. He is the head of global terrorism. He is the head of the snake of global terrorism. We must take him out. They're always talking about this. Weapons of mass destruction. Now, over 700 weapon inspections were done in Iraq. They never found weapons of mass destruction, but they did find these weapons of mass destruction. Cha-ching. Nice. Beautiful big load of gold. Weapons of mass destruction, guys. So now the US launch campaigns in Iraq. I believe they name some of these campaigns like Free Iraqi, Freedom of Iraq. They literally name it like that. Like, we need to free the people of Iraq. We need to free them. Well, how well did that end up? Well, the US puts boots on the ground in Iraq. They dismantle Saddam Hussein's army, his military. guess what that led to? Well, you have all these highly trained military men who have now just been dispatched from their jobs working in the military. So now they go and form groups like ISIS. Nice work. Yeah, you have a bunch of unemployed military trained men. They're going to be pretty pissed off. So you create more terrorists than stopping terrorists. Now, human rights groups, they estimate that Saddam Hussein killed somewhere between 200 to 250,000 of his own people. Huge numbers, okay? But then just 8 years after the US being in Iraq, over 1 million, estimates of 1 million Iraqis. So Operation Free Iraqi, what's going on here? How the hell is any of this leading to helping the people from Iraq? What the fuck are you talking about? Operation Freedom Iraq, like what are you talking about? You killed more Iraqis than Saddam Hussein killed. And he's supposed to be an evil guy. So 1 million Iraqis dead, trillions of US taxpayer dollars spent, and more rebellious groups, more terrorist groups started like ISIS. Fantastic. Great operation. The only person this actually benefited, other than private industries and private sectors that make ammunition, planes, helicopters, boots, military boots, the only people that this would benefit is also Israel. Israel benefits greatly from this because this region is now disabled. Is that a word? I got mind blank. This region is now very unstable again, all right, because of what the US just did in Iraq. Now, at the same time, they go and attack Afghanistan. Of course, this is the US occupation and war in Afghanistan. To give you some numbers, these private sectors who make a ton of money from these conflicts, because obviously you've seen that it made no sense to be in Vietnam. Unless you were a private sector, then it makes total sense. Makes no sense to be involved in Iraq and Iran in the war. Makes no sense to put boots on the ground in Iraq, because you just lead to more civilian deaths, and then you just created more terrorist states. Fantastic, unless you're in the private sector, because then you're making tons from weapon manufacturing, Black Hawks, jets. Obviously, you guys can see a pattern here. So, Afghanistan. Let's look at the CEO of Lockheed Martin. Pre-war, his yearly salary and bonuses totaled to about $2 million. The early war period, 2004, 2005, as Stevens becomes CEO of Lockheed Martin, his salary and bonuses go up to $5 million. 2006, just a year and a half later, his compensation, total yearly salary plus bonuses, $18 million. 2007, 1 year after 18 mil, which is already tripling, $31 million per year. So the Pentagon loves giving these contracts. Like, this is a huge business. It's very easy for you guys to see what's going on here. You can understand that war, it's always been profitable, right? But people fall for the propaganda, hook, line, and sinker, the emotional reasons why the war is happening. You can see it never really panned out the way that we were told it was. It never seemed like it was for the reason we were told, because that would indicate that it was a great failure. And they're really not that stupid, because that if you look at the Vietnam War, that would indicate that the US is extremely incompetent. Now, is that more true, or is it more so that they are just not telling you what's actually taking place? I would like you to use your own brain there for a second, because it's either one or the two. The top military experts, analysts, economists, war planning, strategy guys, all of these dudes that are top of their field, it's either that they are extremely incompetent and extremely retarded, or they're just not telling you what's actually going on. Pretty easy to see maybe which one of the two it is. There is so many examples I could give you guys. There is supreme food or supreme groups. This guy was chosen by the Pentagon to supply troops in Afghanistan with food. Guess how much his contract was? I think it was 5.3 or 5.5 billion dollars. What the are you talking about? Holy shit, man. This is all public information. This is what I mean. Like you can read through these guys' salaries. You can read through their company reports because this is public. You can invest in these companies. That is the whole point. You can see this with your own eyes. And people are still so blind. So like, god damn, dude, this is right in front of your face what is going on. But people are at a stage where as long as it's happening over there and it's not happening on home soil, they're okay with it. But this is where it gets a little bit different with what's happening in this current conflict, because previously it seems like the US economy has obviously been stimulated. There's some famous artwork. I love this painting. It is horrific in terms of what it means, but it represents a lot of these wars perfectly, very accurately. I'll see if I can find it. It shows a plane flying over these farmers, these civilians, like a lovely elderly couple trying to grow crops and just survive. And there is a shadow of a huge plane, and they're saying their economy must be collapsing again or something like that. Pretty heavy, but it also makes perfect sense if you have a look at, if you track the S&P 500, if you track stock market, US economy. Previously, all of this has been a great increase in the US economy. Of course, that they're able to make billions, if not trillions, from these conflicts, right? But this conflict seems like a little bit different because there's a lot you can analyze. It's a lot deeper if you analyze the financials, but if you have a look at where the US dollar currently is, the inflation over the last 4 or 5 years, it's leading to a point where it's getting close to a tipping edge, right? And now you know that the US dollar is backed by oil, the petrodollar. Doesn't really make much sense for the US to attack Iran, which, remember, Iran has never actually started a war. They never posed a threat to the US, even though they were talking about this regime needs to go. The Islamic regime in Iran is terrible. They're evil. They are head of terrorists. Basically the same play that was talked about with Saddam Hussein. They're talking about now with Iran. And now this regime is no doubt definitely pretty terrible for their people in some way, shape or form. But you know now who got them into power. The reason why they are radical. Why is that? Now you know. So why would the US now attack Iran when their economy relies on the petrodollar? Like, their economy is heavily reliant on oil. Their relationships with Saudi Arabia, the Gulf states, they've just had to pull their military out of the Gulf states, all of their military bases through all of these states that they had, Bahrain, UAE. Their military has provided not much protection at all for the Gulf states. So this really hurts the US reputation a lot. That's pretty evident in the fact that the US has tried to get other countries to come and help with the Strait of Hormuz, to help unblock it and provide protection for ships to pass through. Nobody wants to join in because people realize this war is pointless and is very dangerous in terms of its escalation and how severe it can get. Now, we've talked about the religious side for the Muslims, because I believe they call it shaitan. I believe the Shia Muslims call the US shaitan. Correct me in the comments if I'm wrong. There is a word that they use to describe the US, because they look at the US as being Satan or the devil, which you can completely understand why over the last 50, 60, 70 years of intervention there. Now, there is a whole religious side for Israel as well, with Judaism. They have which is part of the Greater Israel Project. This is well known. Like you can watch videos about it. You can listen to Netanyahu talk about it. You can just tune in to rabbis that do their live streams about this stuff. So there's a religious aspect for these guys, as well as the Muslims. The Muslims are like the Shia Muslims in Iran. They are happy to fight to the death. Like the Ayatollah who got killed, the leader of the regime, he was made a martyr, right? The US gave him what he wanted. This is where I don't understand how they can... It doesn't make sense that they are purposely so incompetent in terms of their analysis of what's going to happen. Because that would be just like Vietnam. Why would they be that incompetent? It doesn't really make much sense. Surely there must be a greater reason. I'll give maybe some possibilities soon. But taking out the Ayatollah, the head of the regime, and a few of his successors, they just become martyrs. This was during Ramadan as well, which for Muslims is a very holy time. So that is almost the best death that you could give them. Like you have almost done a favor for them, right? The Ayatollah also had, I believe, testicular cancer. So he was already very sick and dying. Crazy that anyone could possibly logically think this is going to be effective. Iran has seen what the US did in Iraq. We didn't even talk about Libya, like all of these other countries. We didn't even talk about them, what the US did. There's so many more examples of free the people, help the people, and it works the opposite way around. So that's what I'm trying to understand, what possibly is happening or why this is happening. Seems to me like there's a few possible reasons. So obviously, Greater Israel Project, they have their prophecy. They had the red heifer sacrifice, although they say it was a practice, it was a rehearsal. A lot of you guys that are atheists, or even if you're just not that religious, if you're listening to this right now from the West, this is going to be mind-blowing, and you're going to turn your brain off and you're going to go scroll Instagram or put on Netflix pure goy slop stuff, right? But this is their words, not my words. I am learning from what they say to try and understand how pieces on the chessboard are moving. The religious prophecy for them, Pax Judea, there's a word for it, but Greater Israel, it's the same map that IDF soldiers have on their sleeve, on their uniforms, right? Now, the religious aspect for them, they have to build 3 holy temples, and they have a whole bunch of other things that they need to do. The red heifer sacrifice. A lot of Jewish people have to return to the homeland, to Jerusalem. And 3 temples need to be built. I think they've already built the last 2. They have 1 temple left. This is on the site of Solomon's temple. Solomon's temple, this goes back thousands of years, okay? This is biblical times. Well, that site holds one of the most significant mosques for the Islamic world. Al-Azak, I always say the name wrong, A-L, I'll spell it here. That mosque, very significant for the Muslims and the Islamic world, right? You've all seen what's been going on in Gaza. Obviously, there is no respect for Islam at all. So a lot of rabbis have been saying that wouldn't it just be an amazing coincidence, an amazing benefit if an Iranian missile hits this 3rd mosque and they can start the construction of their 3rd temple. This is to bring about their Messiah, which in Islam is sort of the Antichrist, right? Because with Christianity, we have Jesus Christ, who in Judaism, they look at him as a false Messiah. So this is just their religion, a brief explanation for Judaism. Jesus Christ wasn't the real Messiah in Judaism. He was the false Messiah. That is why Jesus Christ in Judaism, I believe they say he's burning in hell. He's in hell burning in excrement with Mary, along with his mother. So they have their Messiah who they are waiting to bring back, okay? And then that will create heaven on earth, and their Messiah will help the Jewish people destroy the enemies of the Jews. And of course, for the Muslims, they're all neighboring countries. So this crazy contrast, this huge tension as you guys have seen from the last 4 years, 3 years of what's been going on in Gaza, this is just like, it's in your face, it's right there, it's very easy to see what's happening. And nothing really stands in the way. Women, children, doesn't matter. None of this matters. Countries that aren't even involved, they're getting hit, they're getting airstriked. It doesn't matter for them. This is what they want to achieve. Now, why would the US be involved so heavily? Well, you have a couple of possible theories. You have obviously the blackmail aspect, which you guys know from the Einstein files. You guys have seen that. That's been publicly very brutal and very confronting for a lot of people to read through and look through, because it's obviously extremely heinous. It is some of the worst stuff you could possibly imagine. But at the same time, it would be easy to see how that is a blackmail operation, right? It's funny how the news reports that Einstein, you know who I'm talking about, Epstein, he was maybe a Russian spy, a Russian operative. That's a possible theory why the US is even involved. Obviously, they do anything for Israel. They are great allies. Now, what else could be the benefit? Because how can there be a benefit for the US here? Because Iran, the regime, is going to fight to the death. They're going to keep going until they're all wiped out. Regime change, blah, blah, blah. Makes no sense that they're doing this now for the people of Iran. They're going to give people of Iran freedom. They're going to liberate the people of Iran. You already know this makes no sense. You look at Iraq, you look at Syria, you look at, Libya, Syria, Libya, all of these examples in the Middle East. It's never how they say. Iraq, Vietnam, we've just explained all this. So that's not the reason. So then what could be the reason? Is there anything that would explain why they are purposely hurting the economy? Because it's their own petrodollar. It's their own relationships that are getting hurt here. Why would you do that to yourself? Why would you bring about pain? Unless you want to reshift and realign the economy. Or maybe you want to reshift how the global reserve currency works. Well, we have some insight into this 2030 agenda. We know a lot of nations are turning to CBDCs, central bank digital currencies. So to get people on board with central bank digital currencies and a digitized world, to get them on board, a very easy way would be to create chaos, create uncertainty in the financial markets, the financial system that we're used to, create crazy uncertainty, inflation, have the paper dollar go down in value, and then you can propose a more stable way and a safer way for people to hold value and keep value in their money, right? You create fear and panic, and then you give a outcome or a possible solution. And right now, for a lot of people already, CBDCs would be a great solution. A lot of people would be like, okay, especially if you inflate the price of gold. What's the price of gold at the moment? If you inflate the price of silver, if oil becomes extremely, extremely high, that's going to hurt the economy massively. And why would they do that? Doesn't make sense why they would purposely do this, why they would get into a position where this could possibly happen. Now, I just wanted to chat with you about that, because what else am I going to do? Flights are cancelled, can't go anywhere. So if you have any other theories, or if you have any more information, drop it in the comments. I would like to read through. This video is not monetized, so I just filmed, researched, gave you guys a bit of a historical overview without any profit from YouTube. So this whole video is net zero for me, because it goes into a little bit more touchy subjects. Don't want to risk having that taken down. So if you want to help me, there's a buy me a coffee comment link. I'll pin it in the comments. But also, if you want to learn more, you guys know that I got absolutely cooked in a motorbike accident last year. Snapped my leg in half, my femur, the biggest bone in your body, snapped my arm in multiple places, had 19 screws in my wrist, got a metal rod in my leg, and I recovered as fast as a Batman does. Pretty phenomenal recovery. I detailed the whole process. I used experimental ways to heal. So that is in the description. I put together all of this in like a guide. It's like an ebook for healing. So you would actually get a lot of benefit from that, especially if you have arthritis or any injuries and you want to heal. Check that out. I'll put that in the description. That's a way for you to help me other than me turn on monetization from this video on YouTube. So yeah, we talked about a lot of things. There's a lot that we didn't touch, but I wanted to make that to show you guys what they tell you is going on, what they say is happening, versus what is possibly moving behind the scenes. Now, the CBDCs, the theory of the CBDCs, that's already moving everywhere. That's already happening. We have like huge companies like BlackRock, right? These massive companies. They are moving across to having everything digitalized. Can't say some pronunciations. I'm lagging. So they're already doing this. This is happening right now. And a great way to move more people and move the general public is by creating the chaos in the financial institutions and the financial economy. But it's very important that you guys look into the religious aspect of this, because even though you're atheist, and if you're a boomer, if you're an older generation, you're just like, what the hell? What's he talking about? Well, you guys just, there's a lot that you guys don't know. So take the time to look into this, because this is their words and not my words. This is just repeating what they say. So it's important for you to look into the greater Israel, look into their prophecies, and obviously bringing back the Messiah. Look into that stuff, and look into what Shia Islam is. Look into a few of the terms that I said. Shaitan, I believe I said. So look into this stuff. Dig into it a little bit further, and you might see that there is a lot more possibly happening behind the scenes than just the US coming in to help the people of Iran. Obviously, if you can analyze the chessboard, pretty easy to see what's going on. All right, I'm going to stop rambling now. See you on the next video. Peace out.